Welcome to Transition Plans. I'm Bill Stalter, and in this webinar, I'm going to discuss funeral planning and pre-need contracts. I'll start out by providing resources for planning guides, and I'll break those into two parts: the memorialization of your life and the care your body will require. And then I'll conclude by discussing the funding of your burial plan.
In a recent survey, 9 out of 10 people agreed that there is a benefit to having a family discussion about end-of-life care decisions and what should be done with their body. That same survey found that only 40% of people carry through and have a family discussion about their end-of-life preferences. 60% of us die without sharing what we want for a funeral. That explains why there are so many arguments at the funeral home when families meet to make arrangements for Dad. Family arguments about arrangements can become very ugly and divide the family for years. For the sake of their surviving family members, I strongly recommend to my clients that they get funeral planning guides and make the essential decisions. The internet is a good resource for funeral planning guides, but I'd recommend starting local. If your family has an established relationship with a funeral home, that might be the best place to start. Almost every funeral home has a funeral planning guide to provide. If you don't have a relationship or you're hesitant about visiting a funeral home, then you may call or email one of their funeral directors to request the planning guide. There are two aspects of funeral planning. One is the care for your body, and the other is memorialization for your life. I'd recommend, though, that you at some point need to visit with your local funeral director before finalizing your plans. The funeral director will provide more detail about the different services or merchandise they provide and what will be required for your body according to your plan. With regard to memorialization, you may want to speak with your pastoral minister. They're usually the staff member best equipped to help with end-of-life care. Some churches have very useful planning guides, but some churches have very basic guidelines. And if you're awaiting a traditional burial or cremain interment at a cemetery, then you should also speak with a cemetery manager about the options and their costs. The internet can be a good source for planning your memorialization. When a church does not offer useful planning material, your denomination's website may. We have also found religious planning guidelines that can easily be adapted for use by other Protestant denominations. And Catholic-based planning guides are numerous on the internet. And if you're not religious, there are several internet sources that provide guides for memorial service planning. Consumer advocacy groups, such as the Funeral Consumer Alliance, provide online planning resources as well. When you begin to plan the memorialization for your funeral, it is a good point to start to involve family members. For family members, this is the most important part of planning for them. At the end of this webinar, we will provide some links to planning resources that I found helpful. Completing your funeral plan will ease your family's emotional burden at the time of your death, but it is also time to think about that financial burden. Funeral and burial costs together can easily exceed $10,000. Funerals are not immune from inflation. Costs have been rising faster than Social Security benefits and investment returns. To avoid your funeral becoming a financial burden to your family, you should really consider pre-funding your funeral plan. This is where I believe that pre-need contracts remain the best choice for the funding of a funeral plan. Estate attorneys will recommend to their clients that they can fund a funeral through probate or a living trust or conventional life insurance. Those options are impractical. A probate estate may take weeks to open. A funeral may have to be paid within days. Living trusts require the appointment of a successor trustee, and that could also take weeks. Conventional insurance takes weeks to pay death proceeds. Many funeral homes no longer accept assignments of conventional insurance proceeds. Some consumer advocates recommend against pre-need contracts and instead offer POD accounts or Totten trusts. I don't believe those work. POD accounts cannot keep up with rising funeral costs. And both POD and Totten trusts can easily be diverted and used by the family for other purposes. Some banks don't even offer Totten trusts anymore. Accordingly, I still believe that a pre-need contract is your best way to fund a funeral plan. So I'm going to start out with the basics on pre-need contracts. A pre-need contract can be guaranteed, non-guaranteed, or a combination of both. When we talk about a guarantee, that is where the funeral home freezes the price of certain goods and services at the date the contract is sold. Now, even a pre-need contract guarantee does not cover certain items like cash advance items. These are fees that a funeral home has to pay for a third party for such things as flowers and clergy fees and burial fees. But you have to understand that guarantee is contingent upon the purchaser completing payments as required by the contract. With a guaranteed pre-need contract, the funeral home is assuming the risk that funeral costs will outpace the investment return on their pre-need contract funding. Pre-need contracts can be funded with a trust, life insurance, or in some states, depository accounts. And it is at the funeral home's discretion about the funding they use. A pre-need contract does not typically cover costs associated with the cemetery. Some cemeteries, but not all, sell their services and merchandise on a pre-need basis. Here are my recommendations for your meeting with a funeral director. First and foremost, fill out the planning guide in advance of the meeting. And prior to the meeting, request a general price list and a casket list. If you've not attended a funeral at this home, review its website or Facebook page and look for reviews. It's always good to take a family member to the meeting. Use the funeral planning guide to get input from the funeral director about what services will be required. If the arrangement includes a burial or interment at a cemetery, determine what costs are not covered by the funeral home and request contact information for the cemetery. Ask the funeral director for an explanation of the pre-need contract's cancellation rights and refund. Read the contract over before signing. Take it home to study if you need the time. Involve family members if you're confused by the contract. Ask the funeral home to provide further explanation if necessary. And I have responded to consumer inquiries for a plain English summary of a pre-need contract. If you need to pay for a funeral contract with installments, ask what happens if you were to be late on one or more payments. If you still have questions about funeral planning or pre-need contracts, then I would suggest that you visit www.deathcarelaw.com. I have been writing on these subjects for more than 15 years. We have hundreds of posts about funeral issues and pre-need planning. If your local funeral home is one of our affiliated hosts, you can contact them for the next date and time of our Zoom call. We use Zoom meetings to answer questions about power of attorneys, living wills, and pre-need. Thank you for attending.